Tycoon Millionaire abandoned his wife for a nurse, only to find her at a resort with triplets. Another day, another billion, he muttered to himself, a hint of emptiness in his voice. As he turned to head back inside, his gaze fell upon his wife, Elizabeth, meticulously arranging flowers in a crystal vase. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer outfit screamed old money and high society. "Good morning, darling," Elizabeth said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Don't forget we have the charity gala tonight. The Astors will be there, and I've heard whispers that the mayor might make an appearance." Alexander suppressed a sigh. "Of course, how could I forget? It's only been on your calendar for months." Elizabeth didn't seem to notice the sarcasm in his tone. She continued, "I've laid out your Armani tux. Oh, and do try to smile this time, dear. People are starting to talk about how dour you look at these events. Heaven forbid we give them something to talk about," Alexander muttered under his breath. As he watched his wife fuss over the flower arrangement, a familiar feeling of emptiness washed over him. On paper, they were the perfect power couple. He, the brilliant tech innovator who had revolutionized the industry, and she, the socialite with a heart of gold, dedicated to using their vast wealth for philanthropic endeavors. But behind closed doors, their relationship was as cold and lifeless as the marble floors beneath their feet. Alexander's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A notification about a routine visit to one of Elizabeth's pet projects, a state-of-the-art hospital in the heart of the city. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment. Even their charitable works felt like carefully orchestrated PR moves rather than genuine acts of kindness. As he prepared to leave for the office, Alexander caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The face that stared back at him was handsome, successful, and utterly miserable. He straightened his tie, plastered on the smile that had graced countless magazine covers, and stepped into the elevator. "Another day in paradise," he said to his reflection, the words ringing hollow in the confined space. "Good morning, Mr. Rothschild. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Alexander nodded absently, his mind already racing with the day's agenda. As he slid into the back seat of his waiting town car, he couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that had been gnawing at him for months. "Where to, sir?" his driver, James, asked through the partition. "The office, James. And then, the hospital. Mrs. Rothschild's new wing is opening today." As the car merged into the bustling New York traffic, Alexander's thoughts drifted to the life he and Elizabeth had built. From the outside, it was a masterpiece of success and philanthropy. But inside, it felt like a beautifully wrapped empty box. He remembered the early days of their marriage, the excitement, the passion. When had it all faded into this tepid coexistence? Elizabeth was still as beautiful and poised as ever, but somewhere along the way, they had lost their connection. The car pulled up to the gleaming Rothschild Tech headquarters. As Alexander made his way through the lobby, employees scrambled to greet him, their faces a mix of awe and fear. "Good morning, Mr. Rothschild. Impressive quarterly report, sir. Can't wait for the new product launch, Mr. Rothschild." He nodded and smiled, playing his part in this daily performance. In the elevator, alone for a moment, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. The weight of expectations, of maintaining this perfect image, felt suffocating. Hours later, after a series of meetings that blurred together, Alexander found himself being ushered into a waiting car to attend the hospital wing opening. As they drove, he loosened his tie, feeling a headache coming on. "You okay back there, Mr. Rothschild?" James asked, concern in his voice. "Fine, James. Just tired." The hospital loomed before them, a monument to the Rothschilds' generosity. As Alexander stepped out, camera flashes exploded around him. Elizabeth was already there, her smile dazzling as she waved to the press. "There you are, darling," she exclaimed, linking her arm through his. "Smile for the cameras. This is a big moment for us." Alexander plastered on his media smile, but inside, he felt hollow. As they cut the ribbon and toured the new facility, he couldn't help but wonder, was this all there was to life? Building empires, cutting ribbons, smiling for cameras? As they walked down a pristine hallway, Elizabeth chattering about the state of the art equipment, Alexander's gaze wandered. And that's when he saw her, a young nurse, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, intently studying a patient's chart. She looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his for just a moment, and Alexander felt something he hadn't in years. A spark. He nodded mechanically, forcing himself to focus on the cameras and microphones thrust in his face. But even as he spoke about the importance of healthcare and community support, his mind kept drifting back to those warm brown eyes. As the tour continued, Alexander found himself scanning each room, hoping for another glimpse of the mysterious nurse. His distraction didn't go unnoticed. "Mr. Rothschild, is everything all right?" Dr. Thompson, the chief of staff, asked with concern. "You seem a bit preoccupied." Alexander cleared his throat. "Just taking it all in, doctor. It's overwhelming to see our vision come to life." Elizabeth beamed at his words, squeezing his hand. But the gesture felt empty, a mere performance for their audience. As they rounded another corner, Alexander's breath caught in his throat. There she was again, the nurse, speaking softly to an elderly patient. Her gentle demeanor and genuine smile stood in stark contrast to the polished, artificial world he was accustomed to. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, breaking away from the group. "I just need a moment." Ignoring Elizabeth's puzzled look, he strode towards the nurse, his heart pounding. As he approached, she looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. Up close, Alexander was struck by the depth of her eyes, the subtle freckles across her nose, the wisps of hair that had escaped her bun. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was a warmth, an authenticity about her that he found utterly captivating. For once in his life, the ever-eloquent Alexander Rothschild found himself at a loss for words. "I just wanted to thank you for your work here. It's important." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Rothschild. I'm Sophia. I've been working here for about a year now, and I have to say, the new wing is amazing. It's going to help so many people." As they spoke, Alexander felt something stir within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing colors he had forgotten existed. Their conversation was cut short by Elizabeth's voice, sharp and insistent. "Alexander, we're needed for the final press conference." He turned, suddenly aware of the gulf between the world he inhabited and the one Sophia represented. As he rejoined his wife and the waiting cameras, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. That night, as he lay awake in his luxurious bedroom, Elizabeth sleeping soundly beside him, Alexander's thoughts were consumed by Sophia. Her smile, her compassion, the way she had looked at him, not as a billionaire or a celebrity, but as a person. He knew in that moment that his life would never be the same. The question was, what was he going to do about it? "Mr. Rothschild," Sophia's warm voice called out as he was about to leave, disappointed. "What brings you back so soon? Is everything all right with the new wing?" Alexander turned, his breath catching in his throat. "Sophia, hello? Yes, everything's fine. I just wanted to see how things were progressing." She tilted her head, a hint of amusement in her eyes. 3 times in a week? That's quite some dedication to progress monitoring." He felt his cheeks flush, something that hadn't happened to him in years. He paused, then decided to take a risk. "To be honest, I was hoping to run into you again." Sophia's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and something else, interest, perhaps, flickering across her face. "Oh, and why is that, Mr. Rothschild?" "Please, call me Alexander," he said, his voice softer than usual. I enjoyed our conversation the other day. It's not often I get to speak with someone who's so passionate about their work." Sophia smiled, and Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. "Well, Alexander, I'm just about to take my break. Would you like to join me for a coffee in the cafeteria?" Without hesitation, he nodded. As they walked together, Alexander felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The sterile hospital corridors seemed brighter somehow, filled with possibility. In the cafeteria, over cups of mediocre coffee, they talked. Really talked. Sophia told him about her childhood dreams of becoming a nurse, the challenges she faced, and the joy she found in helping others. Alexander found himself opening up about his own past, the pressure of living up to his family name, the loneliness at the top of the corporate world. "It must be difficult," Sophia said, her eyes full of genuine empathy. "Having the weight of so many expectations on your shoulders." Alexander nodded, surprised at how easily he could confide in her. "It is. Sometimes I feel like I'm just playing a role. You know? Like the real me is lost somewhere." Sophia reached out, her hand briefly touching his. The contact sent a jolt through him. "Maybe it's time to find him again," she said softly. As their break came to an end, Alexander felt a pang of regret. He didn't want this moment to end. "Sophia, I'd like to see you again. Outside of the hospital, I mean." She hesitated, and for a moment, Alexander feared he'd overstepped. But then she smiled, a mix of excitement and trepidation in her eyes. "I'd like that too, Alexander. But we both know it's complicated." He nodded, understanding the unspoken concerns, his marriage, their different worlds, the potential scandal. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. "I know, but I can't ignore this feeling. Can we at least try?" Sophia bit her lip, then nodded. "Okay, let's try." As they exchanged numbers, Alexander felt a surge of excitement and fear. He knew he was standing on the precipice of something that could change everything. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to step back, to return to the safety of his structured life. But his heart, awakening from a long slumber, urged him forward. Walking out of the hospital that day, Alexander knew he was embarking on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, and about what truly mattered in life. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential heartbreak and scandal. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a tumultuous journey that would test his resolve, question his morals, and ultimately force him to confront the true cost of following his heart. One evening, as he sat in his home office pretending to work, his phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. "Tough day at the hospital. Could use a friendly ear. Central Park, our usual spot in 30. Alexander's heart raced. He glanced at the clock, 9:30 p.m. Elizabeth would be at her book club for at least another hour. "I'll be there," he typed back, his fingers trembling slightly. As he made his way to the park, a war raged within him. The guilt of his deception clashed violently with the exhilaration of feeling betrayal. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. Alexander stood there, the enormity of what he'd just done crashing over him. He'd known this moment would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated the raw pain, the sense of a life shattering around him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Sophia. "How did it go?" With shaking hands, he typed back, "It's done. She knows." As he hit send, he heard the sound of suitcases being dragged across the floor upstairs. The reality of his decision was setting in. He'd just blown up his life, his reputation, everything he'd worked for. And yet, beneath the guilt and the fear, there was a sense of liberation. For better or worse, he'd chosen to follow his heart. Little did Alexander know, this was just the beginning of a tumultuous journey. The coming days would test his resolve, challenge his newfound relationship, and force him to confront the consequences of his actions in ways he could never have imagined. The world he'd known was crumbling around him, but from the ashes, a new life was about to emerge, one that would take him places he never thought possible. As he moved through his morning routine on autopilot, the reality of his new situation began to sink in. The life he had known for 2 decades was over. He felt a mixture of guilt, relief, and overwhelming uncertainty. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. News of his separation from Elizabeth had already hit the tabloids. He could almost hear the world's judgment crashing down around him. Alexander Rothschild abandons wife for young nurse. Tech tycoon's midlife crisis ruins perfect marriage. Elizabeth Rothschild devastated by husband's betrayal. Each headline felt like a physical blow. He knew he'd have to face the public eventually, but for now, he couldn't bear it. With trembling hands, he dialed Sophia's number. "Alex, are you okay?" Her voice was laced with concern. "Sophia, I don't know. It's everywhere. The press, they're tearing me apart. Elizabeth, she's gone." His voice broke. "Oh, Alex," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come over?" He hesitated. Part of him desperately wanted her comfort, but another part feared what it might look like. "I don't think that's a good idea right now. The paparazzi are probably camped outside." "You're right," she sighed. "Alex, listen to me. We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we'll get through this together. Okay? I'm here for you no matter what." Her words warmed him, but as he ended the call, a cold reality set in. He was alone in this enormous house, facing a storm of public scrutiny and personal upheaval. As the day wore on, Alexander retreated further into himself. He ignored calls from his PR team, from business associates, from friends wondering what the hell was going on. By evening, he found himself sitting in his darkened study, a glass of scotch in hand, staring at old photos of him and Elizabeth. They looked so happy, so perfect. When had it all become so hollow? A sharp knock at the door startled him out of his reverie. Frowning, he made his way to the entrance, half expecting to find a horde of reporters. Instead, he found Elizabeth standing there, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing with determination. "Elizabeth," he breathed, shocked. "Come in." She brushed past him, her perfume, once so familiar, now feeling alien. She turned to face him, her posture rigid. "I'm not here for reconciliation, Alexander," she said, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "I'm here to tell you that I won't be the victim in this narrative you've created." He flinched at her words. "Elizabeth, I never meant dash." "Save it," she cut him off. "You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I'm gonna fight for everything we've built together. The company, the foundations, our reputation. I won't let you destroy it all for some fling." Alexander felt a surge of anger at her dismissal of his feelings for Sophia, but he bit it back. He had no right to be angry, not now. "What do you want from me, Elizabeth?" he asked, suddenly feeling very tired. Her eyes softened for a moment, and he saw a glimpse of the woman he'd spent half his life with. "I want you to remember who you are, Alexander, who we were together. And I want you to ask yourself if this new life you're chasing is really worth losing everything for." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Alexander standing in the foyer, feeling more lost than ever. As the door closed behind her, he slumped against the wall, the weight of his decisions crushing down on him. He'd known there would be consequences, but facing them head-on was more painful than he'd imagined. In that moment, torn between his past and his uncertain future, Alexander realized that his journey was far from over. The coming days would test not only his love for Sophia but also his own sense of self. As he stood there, alone in the echoing silence of his once perfect life, he couldn't help but wonder, had he made the biggest mistake of his life, or was this the beginning of something truly extraordinary? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to escape the city. Alexander had arranged for a private jet to whisk them away to a secluded island resort. As the plane took off, he felt the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Sophia said, her eyes wide with excitement as she gazed out the window at the shrinking cityscape below. Alexander reached over and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his. "Believe it. For the next 2 weeks, it's just you and me. No press, no lawyers, no complications." As they settled into their seats, Sophia's expression grew serious. "Alex, are you sure about all this? I mean, you've given up so much. Your marriage, your reputation." He turned to face her fully, cupping her face in his hands. "Sophia, listen to me. Yes, I've lost a lot, but what I've gained, This chance at real happiness. At love, it's worth everything. You're worth everything. Tears welled up in her eyes as she leaned in to kiss him softly. I love you, Alexander Rothschild. And I love you, Sophia Carter, he replied, feeling a surge of emotion so strong it almost overwhelmed him. The flight passed in a haze of champagne, stolen kisses, and whispered promises. By the time they landed, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the tropical paradise that would be their home for the next fortnight. Their private villa was a slice of heaven, all open-air rooms, infinity pools, and breathtaking ocean views. As they stood on the balcony, watching the stars come out over the water, Alexander felt a peace he hadn't known in years. It's beautiful, Sophia breathed, leaning back against his chest. It is, he agreed, but he wasn't looking at the view. His eyes were fixed on her, drinking in every detail of her face in the moonlight. That night, as they made love under the stars, Alexander felt as though he was truly alive for the first time. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered endearment was charged with an intensity he'd never experienced before. In the afterglow, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Sophia traced lazy patterns on his chest. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'm thinking that I want to spend the rest of my life feeling the way I do right now. With you." Sophia propped herself up on an elbow, her eyes searching his face. "Alex, are you saying?" He nodded, suddenly sure of what he wanted. "Marry me, Sophia. When all this craziness is over, when the divorce is finalized, be my wife." Her eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As they sealed their engagement with a passionate kiss, Alexander felt as though his heart might burst with happiness. This was what he'd been missing all those years, this raw, all-consuming love. But even as he reveled in his newfound bliss, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Was he moving too fast? Was this passionate affair strong enough to withstand the pressures of real life waiting for them back home? For now, he pushed those doubts aside, losing himself in Sophia's embrace. They had 2 weeks of paradise ahead of them, 2 weeks to strengthen their bond and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Little did Alexander know, those challenges would test their love in ways he could never have imagined. The fairy tale beginning of their relationship was about to collide head-on with the harsh realities of life, and the choices they made in the coming months would shape not just their future, but the lives of everyone around them. "I wish we could stay here forever," Sophia sighed, her head resting on Alexander's chest as they lounged on the beach, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues. Alexander kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her hair mixed with sea salt. "We could, I could buy this island and we could just disappear." Sophia chuckled, but it was hollow. "As tempting as that sounds, we both know we can't run from our responsibilities forever." He tightened his arms around her, feeling a surge of protectiveness. "I know. I'm worried about what we're going back to. The media frenzy, the legal battles with Elizabeth, the judgment from everyone." Sophia sat up, her eyes meeting his with a fierce determination. "Hey, we knew this wasn't going to be easy, but we're in this together, remember? Whatever comes, we'll face it side by side." Alexander nodded, trying to draw strength from her confidence. But as they boarded the private jet the next morning, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in his stomach. Their arrival in New York was exactly the circus they'd anticipated. Paparazzi swarmed the airport, shouting questions and snapping photos. Alexander instinctively pulled Sophia close, shielding her from the onslaught as they made their way to the waiting car. "Mr. Rothschild, is it true you left your wife for a nurse?" "Sophia, how does it feel to be a homewrecker?" "Alexander, what about the charity foundations you run with Elizabeth?" The questions bombarded them, each one feeling like a physical blow. Once safely in the car, Sophia broke down, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, Alex, I knew it would be bad. But how are we going to live like this?" He pulled her close, his own heart racing. It'll die down, love. We just need to weather the storm. But as they drove through the city, the reality of their situation became increasingly clear. Billboards that once featured Alexander and Elizabeth's smiling faces promoting their charitable work now seemed to mock them. News tickers in Times Square flashed updates about the Rothschild scandal. When they finally reached Alexander's penthouse, both were emotionally exhausted. As they stepped into the elevator, Sophia's phone buzzed. She looked at it and went pale. "What is it?" Alexander asked, concern etching his features. Sophia's voice trembled as she replied, It's the hospital. They want to see me first thing tomorrow morning." The implications hung heavy in the air. Would Sophia lose her job over this? The thought made Alexander's stomach churn with guilt. As they entered the penthouse, the emptiness hit Alexander like a physical force. Elizabeth's touches were everywhere in the art on the walls, the carefully curated decor. It no longer felt like home. Sophia wandered to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city sprawled below. "Alex," she said softly, "are we going to be okay?" He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "We have to be," he whispered, as much to convince himself as her. "We've risked everything for this love. It has to be worth it." But as they stood there, the glittering city lights seemed cold and distant. The fairy tale of their island getaway was over, and the harsh light of reality was setting in. Alexander couldn't help but wonder. Had they underestimated the cost of their happiness? And more importantly, were they strong enough to pay it? As night fell over the city, Alexander and Sophia clung to each other, both silently praying that their love would be enough to weather the storm that was only just beginning. Little did they know, the true tests of their relationship were yet to come, and the decisions they would face would challenge not just their love, but their very identities. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings for Alexander and a double shift at the hospital for Sophia, who had managed to keep her job, albeit with a stern warning, they found themselves at odds over something as simple as dinner plans. "I've made reservations at Le Bernardin," Alexander said, loosening his tie as he walked into the living room. "I thought we could use a nice night out." Sophia, still in her scrubs and visibly exhausted, looked at him with disbelief. "Alex, I just worked a 16-hour shift. The last thing I want to do is get dressed up and go to a fancy restaurant." Alexander frowned, genuinely puzzled. "But I thought you'd want to relax and unwind. The food there is exquisite and relax." Sophia interrupted, her voice rising. "Alex, relaxing for me is ordering takeout and watching Netflix in my pajamas. Not putting on a cocktail dress and making small talk with New York's elite." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken frustrations. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling out of his depth. "I'm sorry, I thought it would be nice. I didn't realize " Sophia's expression softened slightly. "No, I'm sorry. I know you're trying. This is all so new to me. The constant attention, the luxury, the expectations. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in it all." Alexander moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her hand in his. "Talk to me, Sophia. What's really bothering you?" She sighed deeply, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's everything, Alex. The paparazzi following us everywhere. The whispers at the hospital. The dirty looks from your high society friends. And then there's us. Sometimes I feel like we're from different planets." Alexander felt a pang of fear in his chest. "What do you mean?" Sophia turned to face him fully, her expression a mix of love and worry. "I mean, look at us. You want to go to 5-star restaurants, I want to eat pizza on the couch. You have a wardrobe full of designer suits. I live in scrubs and jeans. You're used to board meetings and charity galas. I'm used to night shifts and emergency rooms. I wonder sometimes if we're too different." The weight of her words hung between them. Alexander felt a surge of panic. He cupped her face gently, his eyes searching hers. "Sophia, listen to me. Yes, we come from different worlds. But that's what I love about you. You ground me. You remind me of what's real and important in life. I don't want to change you. I want to learn from you." Tears spilled down Sophia's cheeks as she leaned into his touch. I love you too, Alex. So much. I'm scared. What if love isn't enough? What if we can't bridge this gap between us? Alexander pulled her close, his own eyes stinging with emotion. Then we'll build a bridge together, step by step. I'm not giving up on us, Sophia. Are you? She shook her head, burying her face in his chest. No, never. I'm in this all the way. As they held each other, both felt a mix of relief and trepidation. They had overcome this hurdle, but both knew it was just the beginning. Their love was strong, but the real world was proving to be a formidable opponent. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Sophia turned to Alexander with a small smile. You know what? I could really go for some of that exquisite Lou Bernardine food right about now. Alexander chuckled, pulling her closer. How about a compromise? I'll call in a favor and have them deliver. We can eat like kings while watching whatever Netflix show you want. Sophia's eyes lit up. Now that sounds perfect. As they drifted off to sleep, both felt a renewed sense of hope. They were different, yes, but perhaps those differences could make them stronger. Little did they know, the challenges they'd faced so far were just the tip of the iceberg. The coming months would test their love, their commitment, and their very identities in ways they could never have imagined. It was a crisp autumn morning when Sophia burst into Alexander's home office, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. Alexander looked up from his laptop, immediately sensing something was amiss. Sophia? What's wrong? He asked, rising from his chair. She stood there for a moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, Alex, I'm pregnant. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Alexander felt a rush of emotions, shock, joy, fear, all crashing over him at once. Pregnant? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you sure? Sophia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. 3 tests, all positive. I don't know how this happened. We were always so careful. Alexander moved towards her, pulling her into a tight embrace. He could feel her trembling against him. It's okay, he murmured into her hair. We're in this together, remember? As they stood there, holding each other, the reality of the situation began to sink in. A baby. They were going to have a baby. In the midst of all the chaos and controversy surrounding their relationship, they had created a new life. Sophia pulled back slightly, her eyes searching Alexander's face. What are we going to do, Alex? The timing. It's not ideal. The divorce isn't even finalized yet. And the media, when we have 3 little ones on the way who need us to be strong. As they held each other, both felt the magnitude of the challenge ahead. They knew the coming months would be a battle against Elizabeth, against the media, against the world that seemed determined to tear them apart. But in that moment, with Sophia in his arms and their unborn children growing stronger each day, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. They had overcome so much already. Perhaps, just perhaps, their love was strong enough to weather this storm too. Little did they know, the true test of their relationship was yet to come. As the media frenzy grew and the pressure mounted, Alexander and Sophia would be forced to confront not just the world, but their own deepest fears and insecurities. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but it also held the potential for redemption, growth, and a love deeper than either of them had ever imagined possible. The moment she stepped onto the pristine beach, Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The soft sand beneath her feet, the gentle lapping of the waves, and the warm sun on her skin seemed to wash away months of stress and heartache. As she settled into her luxurious beachfront villa, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, eyes tired, face drawn, the perfect image of the scorned wife she had become in the public eye. She shook her head, determined to leave that persona behind, at least for the duration of her stay. On her 3rd day at the resort, as she lounged by the pool with a book she wasn't really reading, a cheerful voice broke through her reverie. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Elizabeth looked up to see a woman about her age, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "No, please, help yourself," she replied, gesturing to the empty lounger beside her. "I'm Margaret," the woman said, extending her hand. "I couldn't help but notice you've been here alone. I hope you don't mind me saying hello." For a moment, Elizabeth hesitated. She had come here to be alone, after all. But something in Margaret's genuine warmth made her reconsider. "Not at all," she said, managing a small smile. "I'm Elizabeth." As they chatted, Elizabeth found herself opening up to this stranger in a way she hadn't to anyone in months. Margaret listened without judgment as Elizabeth shared a sanitized version of her story. A painful divorce, a betrayal, the loss of the life she had known. "Oh, my dear," Margaret said, reaching out to squeeze Elizabeth's hand. "I'm so sorry you've been through all that. But you know what? I think you're incredibly brave." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. "Brave? I don't feel brave. Most days I feel lost." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "But you're here, aren't you? You're not hiding away. You're facing the world, even if it's just this little corner of it. That takes courage." As they continued to talk, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't in a long time. A genuine connection with another person. Margaret shared her own story of overcoming adversity, of reinventing herself after a personal tragedy. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "sometimes life's greatest challenges are also our greatest opportunities for growth. This isn't the end of your story, Elizabeth. It's just the beginning of a new chapter." For the first time in months, Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. I think you might be right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I've spent so long defining myself by my marriage, by the charities, by what others expected of me. Maybe it's time I figure out who Elizabeth really is." Margaret beamed at her. "Now that sounds like a worthy adventure. And you know what? I think this resort is the perfect place to start." As the days passed, Elizabeth found herself experiencing a transformation. She tried new activities, yoga on the beach, snorkeling in crystal-clear waters, even a cooking class using local ingredients. With each new experience, she felt more like herself. Not the polished socialite or the betrayed wife, but simply Elizabeth. One evening, as she watched the sunset from her balcony, Elizabeth realized something profound. For the first time since Alexander had left her, she didn't feel angry or bitter. Instead, she felt free. She picked up her phone, hesitating for just a moment before dialing her lawyer's number. "Charles? It's Elizabeth. I've been doing some thinking about the divorce proceedings. I think it's time we take a different approach." As she outlined her new perspective, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited to find out. Little did Elizabeth know, her journey of self-discovery was about to intersect with Alexander and Sophia's story in ways none of them could have anticipated. The choices she would make in the coming days would not only reshape her own life but would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "Alex," she called out weakly from the bedroom. "I don't think I can make it to work today." Alexander rushed to her side, his face etched with concern. "Sophia, love, what's wrong?" She tried to sit up but felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. "I don't know," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "Something doesn't feel right." Without hesitation, Alexander scooped her into his arms. "We're going to the hospital. Now." The ride to the hospital was a blur of anxiety and whispered reassurances. As they rushed through the emergency room doors, Sophia clutched Alexander's hand tightly. "Please," she pleaded with the universe, "let our babies be okay." Hours later, after a battery of tests and examinations, Sophia lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to various monitors. Alexander sat beside her, his face pale with worry. The door opened, and Dr. Chun, Sophia's obstetrician, entered with a serious expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Rothschild," she began, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter and Mr. Rothschild. We've reviewed your test results." Sophia felt her heart racing. "Are the babies okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. "The babies are stable for now, but I'm concerned about the stress they're under. Sophia, your blood pressure is dangerously high, and there are signs of potential preeclampsia. Alexander gripped Sophia's hand tighter. What does that mean, doctor? What can we do? It means, Dr. Chan said gently, that we need to be very careful moving forward. Sophia, I'm putting you on immediate bed rest. You need to minimize all stress and activity. It's crucial for your health and the health of your babies. The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. Bed rest? But my job. The hospital. I can't just... You can and you must, Dr. Chan said firmly. Your priority now has to be these babies and your own health. As the doctor left, Sophia turned to Alexander, tears welling in her eyes. Alex, what are we going to do? I can't just lie in bed for months. And what about work? We need the income, especially with the babies coming. Alexander cupped her face gently, his eyes filled with determination. Hey, look at me. We're going to get through this, okay? I'll take care of everything. Your job now is to rest and keep our little ones safe. Sophia nodded, trying to blink back her tears. I'm scared, Alex. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't carry them to term? Then we'll face that together, Alexander said, his voice firm but tender. But right now, let's focus on what we can control. You rest, and I'll handle the rest. As they sat there, the steady beep of the fetal monitors a constant reminder of the precious lives at stake. Both Sophia and Alexander felt the weight of their new reality settling in. The coming months would be a test of their strength, their love, and their commitment to each other and their unborn children. Later that night, as Sophia slept fitfully in the hospital bed, Alexander stepped out into the hallway to make a call. His hands shook slightly as he dialed the number. Elizabeth? It's Alexander. I need your help. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, Elizabeth's voice came through, surprisingly soft. What's wrong, Alex? As Alexander explained the situation, he felt a mix of desperation and hope. Could this crisis be the key to bridging the gap between his past and his future? Or would it only complicate things further? Little did he know, Elizabeth's response would set in motion a chain of events that would change all of their lives forever, in ways none of them could have anticipated. As she gazed out at the tranquil ocean, Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes life's greatest challenges are our greatest opportunities for growth. With a deep breath, Elizabeth made her decision. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. Clara, I need you to arrange a few things for me, she said, her voice steady with newfound purpose. First, contact the hospital board. I want to ensure that Sophia Carter's job is secure, with paid leave for as long as she needs. Second, reach out to Dr. Amelia Rodriguez. She's the top high-risk pregnancy specialist in New York. I want her overseeing Sophia's care. Clara's voice was tinged with surprise. Of course, Mrs. Rothschild. But may I ask why? Elizabeth paused, considering her words carefully. Because it's the right thing to do, Clara. And because I think it's time for all of us to heal. Over the next few days, Elizabeth threw herself into action. She extended her stay at the resort, working tirelessly from her villa to orchestrate support for Sophia and, by extension, Alexander. She arranged for the best medical care, ensured Sophia's job was protected, and even set up a discreet security detail to keep the paparazzi at bay. A week after Alexander's call, Elizabeth found herself standing outside Sophia's hospital room, her heart pounding. She knocked softly and entered. The scene before her was surreal. Alexander, the man she had once built her life around, sat beside the bed, holding the hand of the woman he had left her for. Sophia looked pale and tired, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that Elizabeth couldn't help but admire. Elizabeth, Alexander breathed, his voice a mix of surprise and gratitude. You came. Sophia's eyes widened in recognition. Mrs. Rothschild, we. Elizabeth held up a hand, silencing their fumbled explanations. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. Please, call me Elizabeth, she began, her voice softer than she had intended. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I'm here because I think it's time we all started healing. She moved closer to the bed, her eyes meeting Sophia's. I won't pretend this is easy for me. But I've realized that holding on to anger and bitterness isn't helping anyone. Least of all those 3 little lives you're carrying. Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes. I don't know what to say. After everything that's happened, Elizabeth surprised herself by reaching out and taking Sophia's free hand. You don't need to say anything. Just focus on staying healthy and bringing those babies into the world safely. I've arranged for the best care possible. And your job at the hospital is secure for as long as you need. Alexander stood, his eyes glistening. Elizabeth, thank you. I don't deserve your kindness after Dash. No, you don't. Elizabeth cut him off. But there was no malice in her tone. But those babies do. And Sophia does. And maybe we all deserve a chance to write a better ending to this story. As the 3 of them sat there, an unexpected sense of peace settled over the room. They were an unconventional group. The estranged wife, the unfaithful husband, and the pregnant mistress, but in that moment, they were united by something greater than their past conflicts. Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a chance to redefine their relationships, to find a way forward that didn't involve more pain and bitterness. As she left the hospital that evening, Elizabeth felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she was looking forward to finding out. Little did any of them know, this unexpected alliance would be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The coming months would bring challenges that would push them to their limits, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and longest-held grudges. But it would also open the door to a future none of them had dared to hope for. A future where forgiveness, understanding, and unconventional love might just be possible. One particularly tense afternoon, the 3 of them were gathered in Sophia's hospital room for a crucial checkup. Dr. Rodriguez, the specialist Elizabeth had brought in, entered with a grave expression that immediately set everyone on edge. I'm afraid I have some concerning news, Dr. Rodriguez began, her voice gentle but firm. The latest scans show that one of the triplets is significantly smaller than the others. There's a risk of twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome. Sophia's grip on Alexander's hand tightened, her face paling. What does that mean for our babies? Dr. Rodriguez sighed. It means we need to consider some difficult options. We could attempt a risky in utero procedure to separate the blood vessels, or we might need to deliver early to give all 3 babies the best chance of survival. The room fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging heavily in the air. Alexander looked shell-shocked, his usual confidence shattered. I don't know what to do, he whispered, his voice breaking. It was Elizabeth who stepped forward, her years of experience in crisis management kicking in. What are the risks and benefits of each option? Doctor? She asked, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. As Dr. Rodriguez outlined the possibilities, Elizabeth found herself holding Sophia's other hand, offering silent support. The younger woman looked up at her, gratitude and fear mingling in her gaze. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Sophia confessed in a whisper. Elizabeth squeezed her hand. You are, she said firmly. We all are. We're going to get through this together. Alexander looked between the 2 women, a mix of awe and guilt on his face. Elizabeth, I don't know how to thank you for being here, for everything you've done. Elizabeth met his gaze, feeling a complex swirl of emotions. I'm not doing this for you, Alexander, she said softly. I'm doing it because it's right, because those babies deserve every chance, and because Sophia shouldn't have to face this alone. As they discussed the options with Dr. Rodriguez, a strange sense of unity settled over the trio. They were no longer ex-husband and wife, or rival and mistress. They were 3 people united in their determination to bring these babies safely into the world. After hours of deliberation, they decided to attempt the in utero procedure. As Sophia was prepped for surgery, Elizabeth found herself in the waiting room with Alexander, an awkward silence stretching between them. I never thought we'd be here like this, Alexander said quietly, breaking the silence. Elizabeth, I know I hurt you terribly, but seeing you now, how you've handled all of this, I realize I never truly appreciated how extraordinary you are. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. Don't, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't about us, Alexander. It's about those babies. About Sophia." He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but I need you to know that I see it now. Your strength, your compassion. I'm sorry it took all of this for me to truly see you." Before Elizabeth could respond, Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the operating room, her face unreadable. Both Alexander and Elizabeth stood, hearts racing. The procedure was successful, Dr. Rodriguez announced, a small smile breaking through her professional demeanor. "But the next 48 hours will be critical. We need to monitor Sophia and the babies very closely." As relief washed over them, Elizabeth found herself pulled into a tight embrace by Alexander. For a moment, she allowed herself to sink into the familiar warmth of his arms, memories of their shared past flooding back. But as quickly as it happened, she pulled away, reality reasserting itself. This wasn't about rekindling old flames or rewriting the past. It was about forging a new path forward, one where the welfare of Sophia and the babies came first. As they made their way to Sophia's recovery room, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in her ability to rise above her pain, concern for Sophia and the babies, and a lingering ache for what might have been. Little did any of them know, the challenges they had faced so far were just the beginning. The coming days would test their newfound alliance in ways they could never have anticipated, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and longest-held beliefs about love, family, and forgiveness. One particularly tense evening, as the sun was setting over the New York skyline, Elizabeth entered Sophia's room to find Alexander asleep in a chair, his hand still clasping Sophia's. Sophia was awake, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and worry. "How are you feeling?" Elizabeth asked softly, taking a seat on the other side of the bed. Sophia managed a weak smile. "Physically, like I've been hit by a truck. Emotionally, I'm terrified." Elizabeth reached out and took Sophia's free hand, surprising herself with the gesture. "That's understandable. But you're not alone in this." Sophia's eyes welled with tears. "Why are you being so kind to me? After everything?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, considering her words carefully. "I've had a lot of time to think lately, about life, about forgiveness, and I've realized that holding on to anger only hurts me. These babies, they're innocent in all of this. They deserve all the love and support we can give them." As they sat in companionable silence, the beep of the fetal monitors a constant reminder of the precious lives at stake, Sophia suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "Sophia? What's wrong?" Elizabeth asked, alarm rising in her voice. I felt them move," Sophia whispered, while replacing fear in her eyes. "All three of them. It's the first time I've felt them all at once since the procedure." Without thinking, Elizabeth placed her hand gently on Sophia's belly. After a moment, she felt it too, a series of small flutters, like butterfly wings beneath her palm. Alexander stirred, awakened by the commotion. "What's happening?" he asked groggily. Then his eyes widened as he took in the scene before him, his ex-wife and his current partner. Hands joined over the swell of Sophia's stomach, tears of joy in both their eyes. "The babies," Sophia said, her voice choked with emotion. "They're moving. All of them." Alexander's face lit up with a mixture of relief and wonder. He placed his hand next to Elizabeth's, and for a moment, the three of them were connected, united by the tiny lives they were all fighting for. As they sat there, marveling at the small miracle, Dr. Rodriguez entered the room. Her expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I've just reviewed the latest scans," she began, her voice measured. "The procedure appears to have been successful. The blood flow between the babies has stabilized, and the smaller triplet is showing signs of growth." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Alexander pulled Sophia into a gentle embrace, while Elizabeth found herself blinking back tears of joy. But Dr. Rodriguez wasn't finished. However, she continued, her tone turning grave, "We're not out of the woods yet. Sophia, your body is under immense strain. We need to discuss the possibility of an early delivery." The room fell silent, the earlier joy replaced by a new wave of anxiety. Sophia looked from Alexander to Elizabeth, her eyes wide with fear. "How early are we talking?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with concern. "Ideally, we'd like to make it to 32 weeks, Dr. Rodriguez replied. "But we need to be prepared for the possibility that it might need to happen sooner." As the doctor outlined the risks and challenges ahead, Elizabeth found herself taking charge once again. She asked questions, took notes, and promised to arrange for the best NICU care possible. Later that night, as Alexander stepped out to make some calls, Elizabeth found herself alone with Sophia once more. "Elizabeth," Sophia said softly, "I need to ask you something." Elizabeth nodded, encouraging her to continue. If something happens to me," Sophia began, her voice trembling, "will you promise to look after them? The babies, I mean, and Alexander." The request hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She stared at Sophia, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. Could she do it? Could she take on that responsibility, knowing the complicated history between them all? As she looked into Sophia's pleading eyes, Elizabeth realized that somewhere along this unexpected journey, her heart had opened in ways she never thought possible. She took a deep breath, her decision made. "I promise," she said, her voice steady and sure. "No matter what happens, I'll be there for them. For all of them." As the words left her lips, Elizabeth felt a shift in the universe. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that her life had irrevocably changed. The coming weeks would test her in ways she could never have imagined, forcing her to confront her deepest fears and longest-held beliefs about family, love, and forgiveness. Little did any of them know, the greatest challenge, and the most unexpected twist in their intertwined fates, was yet to come. Elizabeth was in the middle of a charity board meeting when her phone buzzed urgently. She excused herself, her heart racing as she saw Alexander's name on the screen. "Elizabeth, it's time." Alexander's voice was tight with fear. "Sophia's gone into labor. They're prepping her for an emergency C-section." Without hesitation, Elizabeth sprang into action. "I'm on my way. Have you called Dr. Rodriguez?" "Yes, she's here." "But Elizabeth, they're saying there are complications. The smallest baby. They're not sure." Elizabeth felt her throat constrict. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Stay strong, Alexander." As she rushed to the hospital, Elizabeth's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear for Sophia and the babies, concern for Alexander, and an overwhelming sense of protectiveness for this unconventional family she had somehow become a part of. When she arrived at the hospital, she found Alexander pacing in the waiting room, his face ashen. "They won't let me in," he said, his voice breaking. "They say it's too risky." Elizabeth took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "They're in the best possible hands, Alexander. We have to trust the doctors." For hours they waited, the tension palpable. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez emerged, her surgical cap still on, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Rothschild, Ms. Carter," she began, her voice solemn. "The babies have been delivered. They're all alive, but..." Alexander and Elizabeth held their breath, bracing for the worst. "The smallest one, she's struggling. We've had to put her on a ventilator. The next 24 hours will be critical." "And Sophia?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "She made it through the surgery, but there were complications. She's lost a lot of blood and is in critical condition. We're doing everything we can." Alexander stumbled, and Elizabeth caught him, helping him to a chair. Can we see them?" he asked, his voice hollow. "You can see Sophia briefly and then the babies in the NICU. But I must warn you, it's going to be overwhelming." As they followed Dr. Rodriguez, Elizabeth felt a surge of determination. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it no matter what. The sight of Sophia, pale and surrounded by machines, was jarring. Alexander rushed to her side, taking her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Elizabeth hung back, her heart aching for both of them. Then came the NICU, 3 tiny incubators, each housing a fragile life. The two larger babies, while small, seemed to be holding their own. But the smallest one, "Oh my God," Alexander breathed. His hand pressed against the incubator. "She's so tiny." Elizabeth moved closer, her eyes fixed on the minuscule form, tubes and wires seeming to engulf her. Without thinking, she placed her hand on the incubator right next to Alexander's. "Fight, little one," she whispered. "We're all here for you." As they stood there, united in their concern and hope, a nurse approached them. "Have you decided on names?" she asked gently. Alexander looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with uncertainty. We hadn't finalized anything. Sophia wanted to wait until they were born." Elizabeth took a deep breath, an idea forming. "What about Hope for the smallest one? Because that's what she needs right now." "Hope." Alexander's eyes welled with tears. "Hope," he repeated. "It's perfect. And for the others, Grace and Faith. Because that's what's gotten us this far." As the nurse recorded the names, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of connection to these tiny lives. She may not have carried them, but in that moment, she knew she would do anything to protect them. The next few days were a blur of NICU visits, anxious waits for updates on Sophia's condition, and stolen moments of rest. Elizabeth found herself taking charge, coordinating with doctors, arranging for the best care, and supporting Alexander through his roller coaster of emotions. One evening, as they sat vigil by Hope's incubator, Alexander turned to Elizabeth, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and worry. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly, "for being here, for everything you've done." Elizabeth met his gaze, feeling a complex mix of emotions. "You don't need to thank me, Alexander. I made a promise, and I intend to keep it." As they turned back to watch the tiny form of Hope, her chest rising and falling with each assisted breath, Elizabeth felt a surge of love and protectiveness. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life had changed irrevocably, and she was committed to seeing this through, no matter where it led. Little did they know, the greatest test of their newfound bond was yet to come, as fate had one more twist in store for this unconventional family. One particularly exhausting evening, Elizabeth was sitting by Hope's incubator, her hand resting gently on the clear plastic. She had been reading aloud from a children's book, her voice soft and soothing. "You're going to be okay, little one," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Hope's tiny form. "We're all here, waiting for you." Alexander entered quietly, his face etched with worry. "Any change?" he asked, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Elizabeth shook her head, offering a small, tired smile. "Not yet, but she's fighting. Our little Hope is a fighter." As Alexander took a seat beside her, their shoulders touching, a nurse approached with a hesitant expression. "Mr. Rothschild, Ms. Carter," she began, her voice gentle. "Dr. Rodriguez would like to speak with you both." "It's about Sophia." They exchanged a worried glance before following the nurse to a small consultation room. Dr. Rodriguez was waiting, her face grave. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to the chairs. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Elizabeth felt her heart rate quicken, her hand instinctively reaching for Alexander's. Dr. Rodriguez took a deep breath. "Sophia's condition has deteriorated. The strain of the pregnancy and the complications from the surgery, her body is shutting down. We've done everything we can, but—" "No," Alexander choked out, his grip on Elizabeth's hand tightening. "There must be something else you can do." The doctor's eyes were filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Rothschild. At this point, we're recommending removing life support. It's only a matter of time, and we believe she's suffering." The room fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air. Elizabeth felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath her. She turned to Alexander, seeing the anguish and indecision in his eyes. "Alex," she said softly, her voice breaking, "what do you want to do?" He looked at her, tears streaming down his face. I can't make this decision alone. Elizabeth, please. I need you." In that moment, Elizabeth felt the full weight of the promise she had made to Sophia. Taking a deep breath, she turned to Dr. Rodriguez. Can we see her? Before we decide. The doctor nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. As they entered Sophia's room, the steady beep of machines filled the air. Elizabeth hung back, allowing Alexander a moment alone with the woman he loved. He approached the bed, taking Sophia's hand in his. "Oh, Sophia," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Elizabeth felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she watched Alexander break down. After a few moments, she stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sophia," she said softly, addressing the unconscious woman. "I know we didn't start off on the best terms, but I want you to know, I'll keep my promise. I'll look after them, Alex and the babies. All of them." Alexander looked up at her, his eyes wide, with surprise and gratitude. "Elizabeth, She shook her head, silencing him. "We need to do what's best for Sophia now. And for the babies." They stood there for a long moment, the three of them connected in a way that defied conventional understanding. Finally, Alexander nodded, his decision made. As they left the room to speak with Dr. Rodriguez, Elizabeth felt a shift in the air. She knew that whatever happened next, their lives would never be the same. Little did they know, fate had one more twist in store, a development that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, family, and the bonds that tie us together. As they walked down the corridor, hand in hand, both lost in their own thoughts, a commotion from the NICU caught their attention. A nurse was running towards them, her face a mix of excitement and urgency. "Mr. Rothschild, Ms. Carter," she called out. "It's Hope, she's—" Their hearts raced as they rushed towards the NICU, fear and hope battling for dominance. What they would find there would set in motion a chain of events that would redefine their understanding of miracles and the true meaning of family. "What's happening?" Alexander demanded, his voice cracking with fear and hope. Dr. Rodriguez turned to them, her eyes shining with an emotion they hadn't seen before, joy. "It's incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Hope, she's breathing on her own. We were about to do a routine check, and suddenly, she just started fighting the ventilator." Elizabeth felt her knees go weak, and she gripped Alexander's arm for support. "You mean, she's going to be okay?" The doctor nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "It's still early, but this is a huge step. She's showing a strength we didn't think she had." As they watched, the medical team carefully removed the breathing tube. For a heart-stopping moment, there was silence. Then, a tiny, mewling cry filled the air, the first sound Hope had ever made on her own. Alexander let out a sob of relief, pulling Elizabeth into a tight embrace. They clung to each other, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Can we touch her?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rodriguez nodded, guiding them closer to the incubator. "Gentle touches only, but yes, I think it would be good for her to feel your presence." With trembling hands, Elizabeth and Alexander reached out, their fingers gently caressing Hope's tiny arm. The baby's eyes fluttered open, seeming to focus on them for the first time. "Hello, little one," Elizabeth cooed, tears streaming down her face. "We've been waiting for you." Alexander couldn't speak, overcome with emotion. He simply stroked Hope's cheek, marveling at the miracle before them. As they stood there, basking in the joy of Hope's breakthrough, a nurse approached with a strange expression on her face. "Mr. Rothschild, Ms. Carter," she said, her voice hesitant. There's something else. It's about Ms. Sophia." They turned, fear gripping their hearts once more. Had they lost Sophia just as Hope had turned a corner? The nurse continued, her words careful. "We're not sure how to explain it, but her vital signs are improving. It's as if she sensed what was happening with Hope." Elizabeth and Alexander exchanged a look of disbelief. Could it be possible? Was the bond between mother and child so strong that it could transcend the boundaries of consciousness? Without a word, they rushed back to Sophia's room, hope blooming in their chests. As they entered, they saw a sight that took their breath away. Sophia's eyes were open, blinking in confusion at the world around her. "Sophia?" Alexander breathed, rushing to her side. "Can you hear me?" She turned her head slightly, her gaze focusing on him. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Elizabeth stepped closer, her heart racing. "What is it, Sophia? What are you trying to say?" With a Herculean effort, Sophia managed to whisper 2 words. "My babies?" Tears of joy streamed down Alexander's face as he grasped her hand. "They're okay, love. They're all okay." Hope just started breathing on her own. A weak smile flickered across Sophia's face, and she turned her gaze to Elizabeth. Their eyes met, a universe of unspoken emotions passing between them. "You kept your promise," Sophia managed to say, her voice barely audible. Elizabeth nodded, her own tears falling freely. "Of course I did. We're all here for you, Sophia. For you and the babies." As they stood there, the 3 of them united in a moment of profound joy and relief, Elizabeth felt a shift in the very fabric of their reality. The boundaries that had once seemed so clear, ex-wife, mistress, rival, had blurred and reformed into something new and beautiful. But even as they celebrated this miraculous turn of events, a new challenge loomed on the horizon. The road to recovery would be long and difficult for both Sophia and Hope, and the complicated dynamics of their unconventional family unit would need to be navigated with care and compassion. As Elizabeth looked from Sophia to Alexander and thought of the 3 tiny lives in the NICU, she realized that their journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The true test of their newfound bond was yet to come, as they faced the daunting task of building a future together. A future that none of them could have imagined just a few short months ago. Little did they know, the greatest challenges and the most profound joys still lay ahead, waiting to reshape their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. One evening, as Elizabeth was helping Sophia settle into a wheelchair for a visit to the NICU, the younger woman's voice broke the comfortable silence. "Elizabeth," Sophia began hesitantly, I need to ask you something." Elizabeth paused, sensing the weight of the moment. "Of course, Sophia. What is it?" Sophia took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Elizabeth's with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "When we leave here, what happens next? Where do we go from here?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Elizabeth felt her heart race as she considered the complexities of their situation. I'm not sure," she admitted, her voice soft. "I suppose that's something we all need to discuss together." As if on cue, Alexander entered the room, his arms full of baby supplies. He sensed the tension immediately, his gaze darting between the 2 women. "What's going on?" he asked, setting down his burden. Elizabeth took a steadying breath. "Sophia was just asking about our plans once everyone's released from the hospital." Alexander's face fell, the reality of their situation clearly hitting him anew. "Oh," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I've been so focused on getting to this point, I haven't really thought about what comes after." Sophia reached out, taking one of Alexander's hands and one of Elizabeth's. I think we need to talk about this. All of us." Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. "You're right. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about what's best for the babies." They made their way to the NICU in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they gathered around the Triplets incubators, the magnitude of their decision became clear. "They're so perfect," Sophia whispered, her eyes filled with love as she gazed at her daughters. Alexander nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "They are. And they deserve the best life we can give them." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Hope grip her finger with surprising strength. "Whatever we decide," she said softly, "it has to be for them. Their needs have to come first." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle beeping of monitors and the soft coos of the babies. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice hesitant but determined. What if we tried living together? All of us?" Sophia and Elizabeth turned to him in surprise, their eyes wide. "You mean, like a family?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, his gaze moving between the two women. I know it's unconventional, but haven't we already thrown convention out the window? These girls deserve to have all of us in their lives. Supporting each other, working together, Elizabeth felt her heart racing, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through her. It would be complicated, she said slowly. There would be a lot to figure out. Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. But maybe it could work. For the girls, as they stood there, surrounded by the tangible evidence of their shared love and sacrifice, Elizabeth felt a shift in the air. This wasn't just about co-parenting or maintaining civility. This was about creating something entirely new, a family born of forgiveness, understanding, and an unconditional love for 3 tiny lives. It won't be easy, Elizabeth said, her voice gaining strength. The world may not understand, but if we're all committed to making it work. Alexander reached out, taking Elizabeth's hand in his left and Sophia's in his right. We've already overcome so much. Maybe this is our chance to build something beautiful out of all the pain and confusion. As they stood there, linked together in a circle of tentative hope, the babies seemed to sense the moment. Hope let out a tiny coo, while Grace and Faith wriggled in their incubators, as if reaching out to each other. Sophia laughed softly, tears glistening in her eyes. I think they approve. Elizabeth felt a smile tugging at her lips, even as her mind raced with the practicalities and potential pitfalls of what they were considering. But as she looked at the faces of these 2 people who had become so unexpectedly important to her, and at the 3 precious lives they had created, she felt a surge of determination. Okay, she said, her voice steady. Let's do this. For them. For us. For the family we never knew we needed. As they left the NICU that night, plans already forming for their unconventional future. None of them could have predicted the challenges and joys that lay ahead. They were embarking on an unprecedented journey, one that would test the boundaries of love, forgiveness, and the very definition of family. Little did they know, their greatest adventure was just beginning, and it would reshape not only their lives but the lives of everyone around them in ways they could never have imagined. This is it, Alexander said, his voice a mix of nerves and joy. Are we really ready for this? Elizabeth reached over and squeezed his hand. I don't think anyone's ever truly ready for triplets, but we've got each other. We can do this. Sophia, still weak but determined, nodded from the back seat. Together, she affirmed. As they carried the babies inside, they were greeted by a sight that took their breath away. The foyer was filled with balloons, flowers, and a giant banner that read "Welcome Home. Hope, Grace, and Faith." Surprise, came a chorus of voices. Their friends and family had gathered to welcome the unconventional new family home. For a moment, Elizabeth, Alexander, and Sophia stood frozen, unsure of how to navigate this moment. But then, Alexander's mother stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears. We know this isn't conventional, she said, her voice wavering. But we want you to know that we support you. All of you. These beautiful girls deserve all the love in the world. And if this is how you've chosen to give it to them, then we're here for you. Elizabeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. She looked at Sophia, who was openly crying, and Alexander, who seemed too overwhelmed to speak. Thank you, Elizabeth managed, her voice thick with emotion. Your support means everything to us. As they moved through the crowd, introducing the babies and accepting congratulations, Elizabeth couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought them here. Just months ago, she had been a bitter ex-wife, and now, later that night, after the guests had left and the babies were finally asleep, Elizabeth found herself in the nursery, watching the 3 tiny forms in their cribs. She felt, rather than heard, Alexander and Sophia join her. I still can't believe they're really here, Sophia whispered, her voice filled with awe. Alexander nodded, wrapping an arm around each woman. It's like a dream, a beautiful, terrifying dream. Elizabeth leaned into his embrace, surprised at how natural it felt. We're really doing this, aren't we? The 3 of us raising these girls together. Are you having second thoughts? Sophia asked, a hint of worry in her voice. Elizabeth shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. No, actually, I'm just amazed at how right this feels. How we got here doesn't matter anymore. What matters is where we go from here. Alexander pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Then Sophia's. I love you both, he said softly, in different ways but equally. I never thought I could be this lucky. As they stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the night light, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace wash over her. Yes, there would be challenges ahead. The world might not understand their arrangement. There would be sleepless nights, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But there would also be love. So much love. Just then, hope stirred in her crib, letting out a tiny whimper. Without hesitation, all three of them moved towards her, each reaching out to offer comfort. As Hope settled back to sleep, her tiny hand gripping Elizabeth's finger, Sophia's hand on her tummy, and Alexander's gentle touch on her cheek, Elizabeth knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be. We've got this, she said softly, looking at her co-parents with determination. Whatever comes our way, we'll face it together. Sophia and Alexander nodded, their eyes shining with love and resolve. As they left the nursery that night, closing the door softly behind them, none of them could have predicted the adventures that lay ahead. The joys, the heartaches, the moments of pure magic that come with raising children, the challenges of navigating their unique family dynamic in a world that might not always understand. But one thing was certain. They were in this together, bound by a love that defied convention and a commitment to 3 precious lives that had brought them all together in the most unexpected way. Little did they know, their greatest challenges and most profound joys were still to come, as they embarked on this extraordinary journey of love, family, and self-discovery. One crisp autumn morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the nursery windows, Elizabeth found herself alone with the triplets. Hope, ever the fighter, was babbling happily in her crib, while Grace and Faith slept peacefully. Elizabeth couldn't help but marvel at how much they'd grown, how their personalities were already shining through. Lost in thought, she didn't hear Alexander enter until he wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "Penny for your thoughts?" he murmured. Elizabeth leaned back into his embrace, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. How much has changed in a year." Alexander nodded, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both gazed at the babies. "It's been quite the journey, hasn't it?" Before Elizabeth could respond, Sophia appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with an emotion Elizabeth couldn't quite place. I need to talk to you both," Sophia said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's important." Alexander and Elizabeth exchanged a worried glance before following Sophia to the living room. As they settled onto the couch, Elizabeth felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. "What's going on, Sophia?" she asked gently. "Is everything all right?" Sophia took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I've been offered a position. A dream job, really. It's in London." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Alexander was the first to break the silence. "London? But what about the girls? What about us?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. That's why I needed to talk to you both. This opportunity, it's everything I've ever worked for. But the thought of leaving the girls, of leaving this," she gestured around her, encompassing their unconventional family unit, "it's tearing me apart." Elizabeth felt her heart racing, a mix of emotions swirling within her. Part of her wanted to beg Sophia to stay, to keep their fragile family intact. But another part, the part that had grown to truly care for Sophia, understood the magnitude of this opportunity. "When would you need to leave?" Elizabeth asked, her voice surprisingly steady. 2 months, Sophia replied, her gaze darting between Alexander and Elizabeth. I haven't accepted yet. I wanted to talk to you both first." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. 2 months? Sophia, the girls are barely walking. They need their mother. Don't you think I know that? Sophia shot back, her voice cracking. "This isn't easy for me, Alexander. But I can't just give up on my dreams. Not even for them. As the tension in the room escalated, Elizabeth found herself in the familiar role of mediator. She reached out, taking one of Sophia's hands and one of Alexander's. "Listen," she said softly, "this isn't a decision we can make right now. We need time to process, to think about what's best for everyone, including the girls." Alexander nodded reluctantly, while Sophia wiped away a stray tear. "What if," Elizabeth began, an idea forming, "what if we all went to London, just for a while, to see if it could work?" Both Alexander and Sophia turned to her in surprise. "All of us?" Alexander asked, his brow furrowed. "But what about the company? Our lives here?" Elizabeth shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "The company can be run from anywhere these days. And our lives? Our lives are wherever we make them. Together." As the possibility hung in the air, Elizabeth could see the wheels turning in both Alexander and Sophia's minds. It was a crazy idea, perhaps, but hadn't their entire situation been crazy from the start? We could try it," Sophia said hesitantly, hope creeping into her voice. "Just for a few months. See if we can make it work." Alexander looked between the two women, his expression softening. I suppose we could give it a shot. For the girls. For us." As they sat there, the weight of the decision settling over them, Elizabeth felt a surge of excitement mixed with trepidation. This was uncharted territory, even for them. Moving their unconventional family across an ocean, starting fresh in a new country. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Just then, the baby monitor crackled to life with the sound of Hope's determined babbling, followed quickly by Grace and Faith's cries. "Well," Elizabeth said, standing up and offering her hands to both Alexander and Sophia, "I guess that's our cue. Shall we go tell the girls about their big adventure?" As they made their way back to the nursery, united in their determination to face this new challenge together, none of them could have predicted the twists and turns that lay ahead. London would test their resolve, their love, and their commitment to each other in ways they never imagined. But for now, as they gathered around the cribs, soothing their daughters with gentle words and loving touches, they were simply a family. Unconventional, perhaps, but bound by a love that knew no